Wolfenstein 2: The New Colossus caused quite a few angry internet rants about politics when it came out 7 years ago. On one side, there were YouTubers like Vostovlad, who proclaimed, and I quote, "I am not a Nazi, but the propaganda in this game is of extreme left, and I find that dangerous." End quote. On the other side, Redditors like Blue Shy Guy argued, and I quote again, "You have to be a beep to take this game serious on a political level." End quote. But it wasn't just angry internet people who were angry about Wolfenstein 2. Academic scholars also disagreed on whether Wolfenstein 2 was a political game, and if so, how political it was. So in this video, I'm going to look back at the scholarly argument to see if we can determine once and for all, was Wolfenstein 2: The New Colossus political, and if so, how political was it? I'm Dr. Darren Reed, and this is Video Game Lit Review. Thank you everyone for tuning in. I'm a historian at McGill University, and this is a video series where I try to take academic research about video games and translate it into short, accessible videos based around scholarly debates. Since this is a brand new series, please let me know your thoughts on it, any feedback in the comments below, and make any suggestions on games that you would like covered in the future. Today I'm analyzing two opposing peer-reviewed publications about Wolfenstein 2. The first publication, by Hans-Joachim Backe, argues that the game successfully makes several political statements about able-bodiedness, about masculinity, and about whiteness or race, while the second publication, by Mark Kaethler, argues that the game tried to make these political statements, but ultimately failed. In the video, I'll be analyzing the strengths and weaknesses of both of their arguments, and I'll be ending up with my own opinion. But first, for those who've never played the game, here's a super quick summary. Wolfenstein 2 takes place in an alternate history version of the 1960s, where Nazi Germany won World War II and took over the United States. The game centers around the protagonist, William B.J. Blazkowicz, who attempts to instigate a second American Revolution against the Nazi regime. Throughout the game, he does things like nukes Roswell, New Mexico, has his head cut off and implanted onto a Nazi super soldier's body, meets Adolf Hitler on the planet Venus, and ultimately topples the American Nazi regime. Now there are two elements of the game that angry internet people and scholars have focused their attention on as potentially political: the representation of able-bodiedness and disabilities, and the representation of women, and particularly women of color. Let's start with disabilities. Blazkowicz, the main character, begins the game severely crippled from injuries in a previous game, and players experience this disability by playing the first level of the game in a wheelchair, in which players have significantly reduced mobility and combat skills than they would expect playing any other first-person shooter. It's not until about an hour into the game, maybe less than an hour, that players are removed from this handicap with an exoskeleton, which enables freeform movement, running, jumping, and fighting. Mark Kaethler argues that opening the game with a wheelchair is a really interesting way of highlighting the lived experiences of people, and particularly soldiers, who experience disabilities. However, once players are given that exoskeleton, this emphasis on the experience of having a disability essentially is shattered, because that disability is hidden throughout the vast majority of the game. More than that, once the main character is beheaded, their disabled body is literally incinerated, and they're given a new super able body, seemingly arguing through the game that you cannot finish the game with a disabled body. Mark Kaethler therefore argues that although the game began with a progressive political statement on disability, it failed to sustain this argument throughout most of the game. But Hans-Joachim Backe disagrees. Backe argues that the game makes political statements by creating such absurd plot points that it literally ridicules the very thing it seems to represent. So in the case of representing disability, making the players obtain an exoskeleton that completely erases their disability, and cutting off their body and giving them a new super-abled body are meant to ridicule society's treatment of disabled bodies, as well as society's dependence on technology to increase our body's abilities. Baca therefore argues that by making representations of disability so bad, it is actually doing the opposite, and it is critiquing it through absurdity. The two scholars similarly disagree on the representation of women in the game. Wolfenstein 2 is notable for its host of strong female characters, ranging from Frau Engel, the powerful and sadistic main villain who, among many other things, molests the main character with a gun, to Grace Walker, the main character's strong, strategic ally who he first meets breastfeeding openly in front of strangers, which, considering this was based in the 1960s, is a fairly progressive and strong thing to do. But Mark Kaethler identifies several issues in the representation of these women, particularly in the way that they are sexualized. In one pivotal scene in the game's denouement, the main character's pregnant wife tackles the main character to the floor to save his life, seemingly demonstrating a reversal of the classic strong man and damsel in distress. But the scene is immediately ruined when the pregnant wife rips off her clothes for no reason and begins shooting everyone in the room with her blood-stained, youthful breasts bouncing playfully. Mark Kaethler argues that this is a clear example of the representation of women being crafted for a sexualized male gaze. But once again, Hans Joachim Baca disagrees. Using his same idea of making political statements through absurdity, Baca argues that this bare-breasted shooting scene ridicules the male gaze, criticizing misogynistic representation of women in video games by replicating that representation at an extreme level. We therefore have scholars with two completely opposite analyses of Wolfenstein 2's political messaging. The one, Kaethler, argues that the game essentially has no political message because it replicates all the sexist and ableist discourses of other video games, while Baca argues that the game has strong political messaging because it represents those sexist and ableist discourses at such an extreme level as to ridicule those discourses themselves. As for my opinion, I largely disagree with both scholars because I prefer to think in terms of reception than in terms of intent. On the one hand, I do agree with Kaethler that there's issues in terms of representation of women and disability, and I also agree with Baca that some of those issues are so extreme as to be construed as ridicule. But I would argue that it's players, not game makers, that imbue games with political messages. If someone plays a game and sees something so commonplace as a person with a disability or a strong woman, and they read that as propaganda, then that person is imbuing the game with a political message, not the people making games about women or people with disabilities. But what do you think? If you played Wolfenstein 2, what did you think about the representation of women and disability? If you've never played the game, what do you think of this whole topic itself? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and feel free to suggest any games you want me to cover in the future. And if you liked this video, feel free to check out my other series, History Through Games, or to keep an eye on this series, which I update every Monday. That's enough for today. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next one. Farewell.